Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Naruto met naughty demon Kushina and had kids? And subscribe if you enjoy the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. Naruto Uzumaki stood at its tree line, hands buried in the pockets of his mission jacket, staring at the massive iron gate that marked the forest's eastern boundary. The sign bolted to it, Area 44, authorized personnel only, had been repainted at some point, but the rust had already started winning again. Some things didn't change no matter how many times you tried to fix them. He was 19. He'd helped end a war, trained under a sage, befriended a tailed beast that most people spent their careers running from, and still somehow ended up back here. The Forest of Death, on a solo recon mission. On a Tuesday. Fantastic, he muttered. The mission brief had been simple. Simple being the word the Hokage's office used when they wanted someone to do something unpleasant without complaint. A patrol team had gone silent 2 days ago in the forest's interior. Standard assumption: rogue animals, a territorial summon, maybe a missing nin using the dense canopy as cover. Naruto was assigned to locate the team, assess the situation, and report back. No engagement unless necessary. He'd argued that no engagement unless necessary was basically meaningless when you were sending him specifically. Shikamaru, who had been sitting across from him during the briefing with the specific expression he used when he thought Naruto was being obvious, had said, "That's exactly why we're sending you. You can handle whatever necessary turns out to be. So." Forest of Death. Tuesday. He cracked his knuckles and pushed through the gate. The forest closed over him like a fist. Even in the daylight hours, the canopy here was thick enough that the light arrived on the ground in fragments. Pale coins scattered across a floor of giant roots and moss so old it had moss growing on it. The trees themselves were enormous, the kind of enormous that made you feel like an insect, with bark the color of dried blood and branches that stretched sideways as much as up. Birds called somewhere above. Nothing answered them. Naruto moved fast and quiet, chakra pressed down against his skin rather than radiating outward. Old habit. You didn't go into unfamiliar territory broadcasting yourself. You listened first. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, twice, in different countries, at different ages, and he decided 2 hard lessons on the same subject was more than enough. The patrol team's last known position was 3 kilometers in, near a landmark the maps called the Bone Spire, a formation of pale rock that jutted up through the canopy like a broken finger. Navigation in Area 44 was annoying because the magnetic interference from some of the older chakra-dense trees made compasses unreliable. But the Bone Spire was visible from above and Naruto had spent enough time in this forest during the Chunin exams to have a rough internal map. He moved for 20 minutes without incident. Then he smelled it. It was a difficult smell to describe. Not rotting, not burning, more like the smell of rain before it arrived, that charged, electric quality that sat at the back of the throat, but wrong somehow. Too concentrated. Too intentional. Like something was producing it rather than the weather. He stopped on a branch 30 feet up and looked down. On the ground below, maybe 15 meters ahead, the forest floor had changed. The roots that networked the earth here were disturbed, splayed outward from a central point like something had pushed up from underneath. The soil in the center of that disturbance was darker than it should have been. Not wet, not burned, just darker, the way a shadow is darker than the thing casting it. The air above it shimmered faintly, a heat haze that had no business existing in the cool shade of the canopy. Naruto narrowed his eyes. He'd seen spatial anomalies before, mostly in the aftermath of battles involving high-level space-time jutsu, kamui, Hiraishin, the sort of techniques that left scars on the fabric of reality when used carelessly. This looked similar. But it was localized. Contained. Almost like a door, he thought. He dropped to the ground carefully, landing without sound, and approached the anomaly. The charged smell was stronger here. He crouched at the edge of the disturbed earth and extended one hand, pushing a thin tendril of chakra toward the center shimmer. The shimmer reached back. Naruto yanked his hand away. The shimmer pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat, and then expanded, and the ground beneath Naruto's feet simply ceased to be relevant. Falling through a dimensional rift was not like falling through air. Air pushed back. Air had resistance, had sound, had the instinctive biological reassurance that you were falling through something real. Falling through a rift was more like being erased one layer at a time. Color first, then sound, then the sense of his own body occupying space, and then a complete blankness that lasted for what felt like either 3 seconds or 3 years, and he had no way to measure which. And then the ground arrived, with great enthusiasm, and he hit it face first. He lay still for a moment, on his stomach, cataloging the damage. Nothing broken. Dignity shattered. He lifted his face from the earth and spit out a mouthful of something that tasted like iron and old fire. The earth here was black. Not dark, black, like coal, like the inside of a kiln that had been running for centuries. It was dry and hard underfoot, packed down under the weight of what looked like geological time. Around him, the landscape was wrong in the particular way that made his hindbrain scream that he needed to file this information under not home and act accordingly. The sky was the color of an old bruise, deep purple fading to red at the horizon, either day nor night, with no sun visible and no moon either. There was light, but it came from everywhere at once, sourceless and flat, casting no shadows. The air smelled of sulfur and that same charged, electric pre-rain quality he detected near the rift, but now so concentrated it almost had texture. The terrain around him was rocky and vast. Jagged formations rose in clusters, some of them easily 40 or 50 meters high, their surfaces carved, or grown, he couldn't tell, into shapes that suggested faces without quite being faces. Between the formations, the ground stretched flat and empty, occasionally interrupted by outcroppings of something that glowed faintly red from within, like cooling embers that had never quite gone out. In the far distance, visible through a gap between two enormous rock spires, there was a structure. A fortress, he thought, or maybe a city. Hard to tell from this distance, but it had verticality and deliberate geometry that meant it was built rather than natural. Naruto stood up, brushed black dirt off his jacket, and said okay to no one in particular. Okay was his standard opening response to situations that were bad enough to require acknowledgement, but not yet bad enough to require shouting. He reached inward, touching the familiar warmth of Kurama's chakra. We're not in the shinobi world anymore, he thought in the direction of the Nine Tails. There was a pause, the kind of pause that from Kurama meant he was already analyzing before answering. Then no. The chakra here is different. Denser. Older. This is a demonic realm. I recognize the signature. I've been here before, in a different life. You've been to the demon realm? I've been to many places, brat. I'm 9 tails old. A beat. Be careful. Demonic chakra interacts with yours differently than human chakra does. Your instincts are built for human-scale combat. Don't assume the rules are the same. When have I ever assumed the rules were the same? Approximately every third mission. He couldn't really argue with that. He'd been walking for roughly 10 minutes, oriented toward the distant fortress because it was the only obviously artificial thing in sight, and he had no other navigational anchor, when he heard the chains. The sound preceded her by 3 seconds. A high, metallic singing, the sound of multiple lengths of heavy chain moving through air at significant speed. It was a sound he recognized, distantly, from memories he didn't entirely own. The chakra chains of an Uzumaki, the technique that had been in his blood long before he was born. He turned toward the sound and had approximately half a second to register the figure before the chains arrived. He threw himself sideways and the chains tore through the air where he'd been standing, close enough that the displaced wind stung his ear. He rolled, came up into a crouch, and looked at his attacker. She stood 30 meters away. She was tall, almost his height, which surprised him, with red hair so bright it seemed to generate its own light in this sourceless purple sky. It was long and wild, barely contained by the twist of it behind her head, with strands breaking free around her face. She wore dark clothing, the practical kind that didn't restrict movement, with armored sections at the shoulders and forearms. Around her wrists and ankles, chains were visible, coiling and uncoiling like living things, their ends floating independently in the air around her. Her eyes were what stopped him. He'd expected demon eyes, slitted pupils, unusual colors, the kinds of modifications that marked something inhuman. Her eyes were almost ordinary. Almost violet-gray, sharp, assessing him with an intelligence that was absolute. The irises, when she turned slightly and the knot-light caught them, had a faint glow. But the way they moved, quick, practical, cataloging him from feet to face in 2 seconds, was the sharpest thing about her. She looked like his mother. The thought arrived without warning and without invitation and hit him somewhere between the sternum and the throat. He'd seen photographs of Kushina Uzumaki. He'd seen her in visions, in the Kyuubi's chakra space, had spoken to her echo during the war. He knew what she looked like. This wasn't her. The bone structure was similar but distinct. The height was different. The lines around her eyes belonged to someone centuries rather than decades old. But the red hair, the chains, the particular expression of contemptuous assessment currently aimed at him. His body had reacted before his brain could properly contextualize it, and now he was standing there like an idiot with his guard half down, and a woman who had just tried to kill him staring at him from 30 meters away. She spoke. Her voice was low and sharp, and the language was not one he'd ever heard. It sounded like the chakra chains felt, cutting and ancient. "I don't speak demon," he said. She tilted her head. The chains tightened around her wrists. "Shinobi," she said. Her accent was brutal and her consonants had weight to them, but the word was clear. Human shinobi. In the Ashen Realm. She looked at him the way someone looks at a thing that has broken a rule so fundamental they weren't aware it needed to be stated. "How?" "Through a rift," he said. "In a forest." "I fell through it by accident." She stared at him. "You fell through a dimensional rift." The ground disappeared. The ground, she stopped herself. The chains shifted, and he tracked them carefully. He couldn't tell yet how much range she had or how quickly they could redirect. Human chakra cannot survive the crossing. The compression alone should have killed you. "I'm not entirely human," he said, obviously. Her eyes moved to something behind his sternum, not looking at him, looking into him, and he felt Kurama's chakra respond with a low, instinctive awareness. Whatever she was seeing when she looked at him like that, she saw it. Something in her expression changed. "The Nine Tails. You carry the Nine Tails." Her voice dropped into something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a different register. "Inside you." "Willingly? We came to an arrangement," Naruto said. She was quiet for a long moment. The chains had stopped moving. They hung in the air around her, still and attentive, like an animal that has stopped before a decision rather than after one. "Interesting," she said finally, and the contempt in her expression had been replaced by something more complicated. Not warmth, exactly, more like the specific attention you give something that has surprised you against your expectations. "I am Kuraiheim, sovereign of the Ashen Realm." Or, I was. Something moved across her face that might have been anger if she'd allowed it full expression. She didn't. "Before Zagura's treachery." "What are you called?" "Human shinobi who falls through rifts accidentally and carries demon kings willingly." "Naruto," he said. "Naruto Uzumaki." The chains reacted before she did. They contracted toward her sharply, wrapping tight, and her eyes went wide, not with fear, he thought, but with something like recognition that hadn't been expected. "Uzumaki," she repeated. "Yeah." She looked at him for a long time. Behind her, the purple sky had shifted slightly redder at the horizon, and the sourceless light had taken on a deeper quality, the way light changes before a storm. "Uzumaki," she said again, quieter this time. Something that might have been, that couldn't possibly be, and yet looked like, wonder. The Uzumaki clan broke its ties to the Ashen Realm 200 years ago, when the last of the old blood bond holders died. She tilted her head. "You are a remnant?" "I'm the last of the main line," he said. "Most of the clan is gone. The village of Yuzushio was destroyed." She absorbed that. Her expression didn't change exactly, but it deepened, the kind of depth that comes from adding information to a context that already had weight. "I know," she said, and her voice was flat. "I know why. I tried to prevent it." Her jaw set. "I was otherwise occupied at the time." The implied story in that sentence was enormous. Naruto filed it, and kept his attention on her hands and the chains and the distance between them. "You tried to kill me 30 seconds ago," he said. "I attempted to detain an unidentified intruder in a war zone." She said it with the calm of someone who considers this a reasonable thing to have done. "You survived." "I've updated my assessment." "And what's the updated assessment?" She looked at him for another long moment, and then she smiled. It was not a gentle smile. It was the smile of someone who has just identified an unexpected resource and is already calculating how to use it. The updated assessment, she said, is that you're going to help me take back my throne. Her name, she explained as she walked him toward the distant fortress. Not into it, around it, along a series of ravines that kept them out of sight lines, was properly Kurainoheim, which translated roughly to Princess of the Dark, though she described this translation as both accurate and insufficient. She was not a princess in the human sense. The title was an old demonic designation for a sovereign who ruled by conquest and blood bond rather than by inherited lineage. She had ruled the Ashen Realm for 400 years. Naruto did the math involuntarily. 400 years ago was before Konoha had been founded. Before the shinobi village system had existed. Before most of the historical events he knew about. You're old, he said. I am experienced, she corrected, without inflection. Demons measure age differently. 200 years ago, the same time frame as the Uzumaki clan's break from the demon realm, a rival sovereign named Zagura had moved against her while she was managing a crisis along the realm's northern border. He had used a sealing technique, she said, her voice taking on that careful flatness that he'd already learned to read as anger being deliberately managed. A technique derived from corrupted Uzumaki sealing arts. He had used her own blood bond connections against her, fragmenting her authority. And while she wasn't truly defeated, not contained, not sealed, she had been effectively stripped of her court, her territory, and the demonic forces that acknowledged her sovereignty. For 200 years you've been fighting to get it back? He asked. For 200 years I have been gathering to get it back, she said, and there was a distinct difference in the words. Fighting without foundation is suicide. I have been patient. She glanced sideways at him. I am, apparently, done being patient. Because of me? Because you're Uzumaki, she said simply. And Uzumaki blood opens doors that have been shut to me. He absorbed that. What kind of doors? Zagura used a blood bond technique against me. Her chains shifted slightly as she spoke, an unconscious expression of emotion rather than intention. A blood bond technique can only be fully broken by someone who carries compatible blood. The technique is key to Uzumaki DNA, the original bond holders. When the Uzumaki clan broke the connection 2 centuries ago, I lost that anchor. Every approach I've taken since has failed at the same point. Zagura's seal holds at its core. I cannot unravel it without Uzumaki blood. And I'm the last of the main line, Naruto said slowly. You are Uzumaki Naruto, she said, and there was a weight in his full name, surnamed first the way she said it, that he hadn't expected. Child of Uzumaki Kushina, who was the last Uzumaki to hold a blood bond with the Ashen Realm before her death. He went still, she noticed. She stopped walking and turned to face him, and for the first time something shifted in her expression that was less calculation and more care. The shift was quick, almost hidden, but he'd been trained by people who could read subtle signals in a fraction of a second, and he saw it. You knew her, he said. Not quite a question. I knew of her. The Uzumaki who carried the Nine-Tails seal, who died to protect her child. She held his gaze. I heard of it, even here. Even sealed away and stripped of my court. That kind of chakra event resonates in places like this one. A pause. She was a powerful woman. Yeah, Naruto said. She was. Either of them spoke for a moment. Above them, the bruised sky had shifted another increment toward red, and somewhere in the middle distance, something let out a sound that was either a call or a warning. Kuraiheim's chains contracted briefly, and then relaxed. I don't look like her, she said, and her voice was deliberately level. I'm aware that I do not. If that is where your attention has been, I know you're not her, he said. I'm not that confused. He looked at her steadily. It's just a thing I noticed. I'm dealing with it. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted again, that quick thing that wasn't quite sympathy but was adjacent to it. Good, she said. And then she started walking again. He fell into step beside her. So, he said, you want me to help you break a seal that requires Uzumaki blood, fight a demon lord who's been consolidating power for 200 years, and reclaim a throne I know nothing about, in a realm I arrived in by accident, with no backup. Yes, she said. In exchange for? In exchange for reopening the rift to your world and sending you back in one piece. She paused. And knowledge. I know a great deal about the Uzumaki clan's history. including the period before Yuzashio's destruction. Information that no living person in your world possesses. She glanced at him sideways, including information about why the seal on the Ninetales was designed the way it was, and by whom, long before your parents were born. Naruto thought about that. He thought about the patrol team he was supposed to be finding, though given the rift, he suspected time moved differently here and they might not even notice he was late yet. He thought about Konoha, about Shikamaru's face when he inevitably had to explain this. He thought about the charged, electric air and the black earth and the purple sky and this red-haired demon queen who walked like she owned every surface her feet touched and looked at him like she was doing calculations he couldn't see. He thought about the fact that she tried to kill him first and pivoted to negotiation the moment she'd identified him as useful, which was, honestly, irritatingly, a decision-making process he understood. "Okay," he said. She stopped walking. Looked at him. "Okay, yeah. Okay, I'll help you." He put his hands back in his pockets. "But we're doing this as partners. I don't take orders, I don't function as a resource you point at problems. And if something comes up that I think is wrong, I'm going to say so, and you're going to listen." He met her eyes. "Deal?" She stared at him for a long moment. "You're very loud," she said, "for someone who should be grateful to be alive." "I get that a lot." She was quiet for another moment, and then, "Partners," she said, and it came out with the weight of something unfamiliar in her mouth, a word she wasn't accustomed to using. "Fine. Partners." The chains settled around her wrists, and the red of the horizon deepened, and somewhere in the dark realm around them something howled long and low into the sourceless light. Naruto Uzumaki looked at the demon queen standing beside him and felt, with the particular instinct of a person who has walked into the wrong situation and decided to stay on purpose, that this was going to be one of those things he would be explaining for the rest of his life. He was, despite everything, already curious about what came next. They reached her camp before the light shifted again. It was hidden in a formation of rock that she'd carved, decades ago, she said, during the first years of her displacement, into something between a stronghold and a watching post. The interior was surprisingly livable, in the way that someone who does not require the same comforts as humans but understands their structural needs would make livable. There were flat surfaces. There was something that functioned as shelter from the atmospheric irregularities that passed for weather here. There were stored supplies, in containers he didn't recognize, and a central space where she had laid out maps. The maps were extraordinary. He'd seen many maps in his life. Konoha's strategic maps, the continent-spanning charts used during the war, the hand-drawn mission guides that field units carried in waterproof pouches. These were nothing like those. They were drawn on something that wasn't paper, in a language he couldn't read, but they showed topology with a dimensionality that flat maps didn't have. Elevation and depth seemed to be incorporated into the image itself, so that looking at the map felt slightly like looking down at terrain from above. Kuraiheim moved to the maps with the focused purpose of someone returning to work interrupted. Her chains had settled into resting coils at her wrists and ankles, moving only slightly with her motion. "Zagura currently controls 3 of the 5 anchor points that govern sovereignty in the Ashen Realm," she said, indicating locations on the map that he couldn't yet interpret. "An anchor point is, the closest translation I can give you is a landmark sealed with demonic authority. Whoever controls the anchor points controls the flow of demonic chakra through the realm. He controls 3. I control none." She looked up at him. "But I know where 2 of his are poorly defended." "You've been watching them for 200 years, he said. "I've been watching them for 200 years, she confirmed. "He doesn't know I'm still here. He believes his seal forced me into dormancy. It was effective but not absolute. I was too strong to be fully contained. Instead it pushed me to the margins." Her jaw tightened. "He's been comfortable, and that's ending. That is ending." She looked at the map, and in the flat sourceless light of the Ashen Realm, her expression was the expression of someone who has waited a very long time for a very specific moment. "I need your blood to break the core seal. I need your combat ability to take the anchor points while I perform the ritual. And I need," she paused, "I need someone who can fight in ways that Zagura doesn't know to expect. His defenses are calibrated for demonic attack patterns. A shinobi fights differently." Naruto looked at the maps, at the shapes he couldn't read but was already beginning to parse by context. by the way she pointed and moved. "Show me everything," he said. "From the beginning. All of it. I need to understand this place before I do anything useful in it." She looked at him for a moment with that assessing expression, and then she sat down across from him at the map table, folded one leg under herself, and began. Outside the camp, the Ashen Realm's eternal purple twilight continued, timeless and indifferent. The fortifications in the distance that had once been hers stood solid against the red horizon, and in the margins where she'd survived for 2 centuries, Kuraiheim, who had watched kingdoms rise and fall, who had carried 400 years of sovereignty in the set of her shoulders, explained her world to a human boy from a village called Konoha, who listened with the kind of complete, patient, furious attention of someone who understands that information is the precursor to action. The chains around her wrists caught the faint glow of cooling amberstones, and Naruto's whisker marks cast faint shadows in the same light, and neither of them said anything about how strange it was to be sitting here like this. But they were both thinking it. Not the violent, directional chain sound of combat, not the high metallic singing he'd heard right before she tried to remove his head from his shoulders the previous evening. This was quieter. Rhythmic. The sound of someone doing something deliberate with their hands in a small space. The way a person handles familiar tools without thinking. Naruto lay still for a moment on the flat stone surface that had served as a sleeping platform, staring up at the ceiling of the rock formation. The stone above him was black, veined with something that glowed faint amber in irregular patterns, like fire seen through thick glass. It was almost pretty. He'd fallen asleep looking at it, too wired to close his eyes but too depleted by the rift crossing to stay properly alert, and somewhere in the middle of cataloging the amber patterns he'd gone under. He didn't know how long he'd slept. The light outside, visible through the narrow gap in the rock that served as the chamber's entrance, looked exactly the same as it had when he'd arrived. Purple-gray sky, flat sourceless illumination, no indication of day or night cycle. "Kurama," he thought, "you've been asleep for approximately 6 hours. The Ninetales replied, with the specific tone of someone who had been awake the whole time and was only slightly smug about it. "The demonic chakra environment is dense enough that I can sense the realm's energy cycles. There is something analogous to a day here, though the cycle is longer than yours. You slept through roughly a quarter of it. Anything happen while I was out?" "She left the camp twice. Returned both times. She's been working at the map tables since the second return." A pause. "She checked on you once?" Naruto filed that information and sat up. His jacket was folded beside him, which he was certain he hadn't done. He put it back on and moved toward the map chamber. She was seated cross-legged on the floor rather than at the table, with sections of chain coiled around her lap and spread in front of her. Her eyes were closed. Her hands moved through the chain links slowly, not detangling, more like reading, like she was processing information through her fingertips, each link communicating something he couldn't observe from the outside. He stood in the entrance to the chamber and watched her for a moment. In rest, or whatever this was, she looked different. Not softer, exactly. The architecture of her face didn't permit soft as a descriptor, but the constant sharp assessment was suspended, and what remained was something that had been alive for 4 centuries. You could see it when she wasn't actively performing command at you. The way she held herself was the posture of someone who had learned to carry significant weight over a very long time, and had become so accustomed to the weight that resting still looked like bearing it. "You could announce yourself," she said, without opening her eyes. "I didn't want to interrupt. You've been standing there for 40 seconds. She opened her eyes and looked at him with the familiar calculating expression. "That's not hesitation. That's evaluation." He didn't argue the point. "What are you doing with the chains?" She looked down at the links in her lap. "Checking the integrity of the blood bond connections. When Zagura performed his sealing technique, he damaged the bond pathways. The chains are an expression of those pathways, physical manifestation of demonic chakra flow." She ran a finger along the length of chain and it pulsed faintly, amber for a moment before fading back to the dull gray of iron. "Some sections have healed. Some still show the damage. It's useful to assess before we move." "They're connected to you physically?" he asked. "Not just the technique you use?" "Both," she said. "They are technique and anatomy simultaneously. Removing them would be..." She paused. "Inadvisable." He nodded slowly. He thought of the chains his mother had used, the ones he'd seen in visions during the war. Kushina's chains had been different. Bright gold, enormous, anchored to her will and deployed with precision. Kuraiheim's were iron dark and constantly present, wound around her like something that had grown there. Different from Uzumaki chains, he said. She looked up at him sharply. You're familiar with them. My mother used them. Uzumaki chains derive from the same origin as mine, she said. When the first of your clan formed the blood bond with the Ashen Realm, they developed the chain technique as a physical expression of that bond. It passed down through the clan as an inherited ability. What your mother had, she tilted her head. It was a reflection of what I carry. A copy, humanized and adapted. Impressive, given the dilution of the original. She was pretty impressive in general, Naruto said, so I gather. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite its absence. Sit down, we have a great deal to discuss before we move, and I find it difficult to think when someone is standing over me. He sat, cross-legged on the other side of her spread chains. Tell me, she said, what you understand about demonic sovereignty. I understand essentially nothing about it, he said. I didn't know the demon realm was real until 12 hours ago. She looked at him as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then I'll give you the foundation. She set the chains aside, coiling them neatly at her hip, and turned to face him fully. In the shinobi world, power flows through humans. Chakra, bloodlines, technique, political authority, it all moves through individual people and their relationships. In the Ashen Realm, power flows through place. The terrain itself carries demonic chakra, and sovereignty is the ability to direct that flow. A demon lord who controls the anchor points controls the chakra distribution of the realm. Every demonic entity here is connected to that flow. They draw from it, they are shaped by it, and they recognize the authority of whoever directs it. So whoever controls the anchor points is effectively the ruler, Naruto said. Not by the loyalty of their followers but by the literal mechanics of power distribution. She looked mildly surprised. Yes. Exactly. Zagura knew this when he moved against me. Taking the anchor points wasn't just a strategic military action. It was a transfer of fundamental authority. The demonic entities that had served under my sovereignty for centuries simply began to shift their allegiance, not through choice but through the pull of the chakra flow he was now directing. Her expression hardened. It is extraordinarily difficult to build loyalty in defiance of that pull. The demons who still follow me do so through something more than chakra flow connection. Personal bond. Ideological alignment. Stubbornness. She said the last word with a pointed lack of self-awareness that suggested it applied primarily to herself. How many do you have? Naruto asked. 11. The silence that followed was the kind that didn't need to be commented on. 11, he repeated anyway. 11 who I trust completely, she said, with the tone of someone who has decided to be precise about this rather than defensive. I have a broader body of demonic entities who have observed my survival over 2 centuries and drawn their own conclusions, and who would likely shift back toward my authority if I retook the anchor points. But the 11 are the ones who have stayed regardless. Where are they now? Dispersed. Staying dispersed is how we've survived. Concentrated targets are easier to eliminate. She looked at the maps spread across the table. When we move on the anchor points, I will call them in, but the initial action will be yours and mine. Walk me through the actual plan, he said. Not the context, not the history. The plan. She stood and moved to the map table. He followed. Up close, the maps were even more remarkable. The material they were drawn on had a slight translucence, and in certain spots the amber light from the stone veins below the table shone through them, illuminating details that were invisible when the light was flat. She touched one of the marked locations and the map responded, the image slightly deepening around her fingertip as though the map were aware of being consulted. Zagura's 3 anchor points are here, here, and here, she said, indicating a triangle of positions spread across the map. His court controls all 3. But these 2, she touched a 4th and 5th location, both outside the triangle, are currently uncontrolled. Wild anchor points. They were always at the periphery of the realm's chakra network, less valuable individually, which is why he didn't prioritize them when he took power. She looked up at Naruto. That was his miscalculation. 2 peripheral anchor points aren't as powerful as his 3 central ones, Naruto said slowly, but they're still anchor points. If you control them, I have a foundation of genuine sovereignty. The chakra flow I can direct from those 2 positions is enough to support a resistance that Segura's pull cannot simply override. She traced the map, and here, at the exact midpoint between all 5 anchor points, there is a location called the binding seat. It is where the realm's deep seal is anchored. Segura's fundamental sealing technique that stripped my authority. It is rooted here. And that's where we break it, Naruto said. With the Uzumaki blood. With your blood, she confirmed. Yes, he stared at the map. The geometry of it was becoming clearer as she talked. The triangle of Segura's positions, the 2 peripheral points outside it, the binding seat in the middle. It was, he thought, not unlike several battle maps he'd analyzed in the war. A centralized entrenched enemy with territory you couldn't assault directly. You didn't hit the center first. You established alternative positions, cut off the flow of reinforcement, and then you made the center unsustainable. So, he said, we take the 2 peripheral anchor points first. That gives you a chakra flow foundation. Then we hit the binding seat and break the core seal with my blood. That restores your full authority, or enough of it to make Segura's hold unstable. And then I call in the 11, and we challenge his 3 points while he's operating with compromised sovereignty. She looked at him with that expression she used when he met her expectations, and she was recalibrating upward. Yes. That is the plan. How dangerous is the approach to the first peripheral anchor point? Moderately. Segura doesn't guard the peripheral points with his main forces because he considers them tactically irrelevant. He has second-hand demons on rotation, entities that owe him obligatory fealty rather than genuine loyalty. They fight mechanically, without initiative. They are strong individually but easily disrupted by unpredictable combat. Unpredictable combat, he said. That's what I'm for, among other things, she said. And then, with the specific deliberateness of someone choosing to say something they'd been considering, I've been watching you move since you arrived. Your combat instincts are very good for a human, thanks. I think, it wasn't qualified, she said. Your instincts are very good. The qualifier I'd apply is that your style is designed for human opponents. The way you read spacing, the angles you default to, the weight you put on your front foot when you're about to engage. Against demonic opponents, some of those defaults will work against you. She looked at him steadily. I can show you what to adjust. He studied her face. The offer was direct, practical, without the performance of generosity that humans sometimes used when they wanted something back for what they were giving. It was pure function. We are partners. You will be more effective if you adapt. Therefore, I will help you adapt. Okay, he said. Show me. Something in her expression shifted in that quick, almost hidden way he was already beginning to recognize. Satisfaction, he thought. Not triumph, not manipulation. The clean satisfaction of a plan developing as intended. They trained for what Kurama's internal sense measured as 4 hours. It was, in Naruto's honest assessment, one of the most instructive and most aggravating 4 hours of his life, which was notable given the competition. The aggravating part was primarily her teaching style, which operated on the assumption that explanation was for second chances and he wouldn't need them. She demonstrated something once, told him the principle behind it in one sentence, and then expected him to execute it. When he didn't execute it correctly, she didn't explain further, she demonstrated again, exactly once, and expected him to execute it again. This process continued until he executed it correctly or she revised her assessment of him, and she seemed to be unwilling to revise her assessment, so he kept going until he got it right. The instructive part was that it actually worked. The 4 principles she was teaching him were, 1. Demonic entities read human chakra signatures as aggressive by default. Any outward chakra projection, regardless of intent, would be read as a direct threat and responded to as such. Against human opponents, Naruto habitually ran his chakra at a slight outward pressure, a low-level awareness broadcast that he developed for sensing enemy positions. In demonic combat, this meant he was announcing hostility to every entity in a 100-meter radius at all times. She taught him to invert the pressure, pull inward, become a chakra void rather than a source, and approach demonic opponents as a near absence rather than a presence. 2. Demonic physical bodies were denser in specific regions than human bodies, and those regions were not where human anatomy placed its vulnerable points. The typical strike patterns he used, solar plexus, throat, back of the knee, base of the skull, would connect, but not with the effect he expected. She mapped the demonic anatomy in the dirt with a chain end, and he memorized it. 3. Demonic combat at the mid-level involved a technique she called in me, which translated roughly as life extension, the ability to keep fighting through injuries that would incapacitate a human. Not healing, extension. A demon with a severed arm didn't stop fighting because the arm didn't send the same signals a human arm sent. He needed to aim for defeat conditions, not injury conditions, and those were different. 4. Demonic entities could sense the emotional state of their opponents through chakra fluctuation, more accurately than even the most skilled human could. Uncertainty, hesitation, pain, and fear all produced distinct chakra signatures that a demon would read in real time and exploit. He had to learn to fight without those fluctuations, or at minimum to produce them deliberately rather than involuntarily. That last one, he said, when she finished demonstrating it, is basically impossible. It's difficult, she corrected. Not impossible. You've done something similar, presumably. In high-level combat, shinobi suppress their emotional tells. Sure, for other shinobi who are reading body language and chakra at a human scale. You're talking about something way more granular. I'm talking about something that becomes natural with practice, she said. We don't have time for full development, but if you understand the principle, you can compensate. Give them something to read that you intend for them to read. Feed them the emotional data you choose rather than suppressing all of it. He considered that. It was, actually, the more interesting approach, not deception through absence but deception through crafted signal. He'd done something similar in combat with particularly perceptive opponents. Fake the hesitation to pull the aggressive overcommit, fake the confidence to bait the defensive retreat. You can explain things clearly when you want to, he said. She looked at him. I always explain things clearly. You explained the first 3 principles in sentences so short I wasn't sure they were finished. They were finished. You said invert the pressure, become a void. That's 6 words. It was sufficient. He stared at her. Are you like this with everyone or specifically with me? I am like this with everyone, she said, and he believed her completely. After the training they ate, which was an experience. She produced provisions from the stored containers he noticed the previous night, compact, dense, clearly designed for someone who needed caloric efficiency more than enjoyment. The food, if it could be called that, was dark-colored, roughly textured, and tasted exactly like the charged pre-rain smell of the Ashen Realm. He ate it without complaint, which seemed to register with her. Most humans find it difficult, she said. I grew up eating instant ramen, he said. My palate is not precious. She looked at him over her portion with something that was almost, not quite, almost amusement. Instant ramen. The extruded noodle dish. You know what ramen is? I told you I have been paying attention to your world for a long time, she said. I know what ramen is. I know a great deal about the shinobi world. I simply haven't been in it. She ate with efficient, practiced motions, without the self-consciousness that people usually brought to eating in company. You are from Konoha. The Leaf Village. Yeah, you fought in the last Great War. Against the resurrected Hokage, and then against something larger. She wasn't asking. Her intelligence gathering had clearly been substantial. Against Kagaya Otsutsuki, he said. The original chakra user. She paused mid-motion. You fought Kagaya Otsutsuki, along with some help. Yeah, she looked at him for a long moment. And you're 19, last I checked. How? It's a long story. I have 400 years of context for long stories, she said flatly. Condense it. He condensed it. He gave her the version he'd gotten reasonably good at giving. The version that hit the structural points without the emotional texture that he didn't feel like sharing with someone he'd known for less than a day. Jinchuriki, the tailed beasts, the Akatsuki, the war, the Sage of Six Paths intervention, the final confrontation. She listened with the attention of someone who was simultaneously receiving new information and filing it against existing context, occasionally asking a single sharp question that indicated she'd been following closely. The Otsutsuki connection to demonic chakra is older than your recorded history, she said when he finished. What you encountered was a fracture of something even older. You should understand that what you fought, Kaguya, she was not the origin. She was a consequence. Of what? That is a longer story than we have time for right now, she said. Later. She stood, leaving the remaining food in its container. We move on the first anchor point in the next cycle. I want to walk the approach before we sleep again. He stood too. You still haven't fully explained the blood bond piece, he said. You said breaking Zagura's core seal requires my blood. What does that actually mean? What do I have to do? She turned to face him, and for the first time she seemed to weigh her words before she used them. The seal is blood key to Uzumaki chakra. To break it, a living Uzumaki blood bond holder must make direct contact with the seal and push chakra through the blood into the seal itself. The seal will unravel. She paused. It's not complicated technically, but, he said, because there was clearly a but. But the seal will resist, she said. It was designed to resist. When it recognizes the Uzumaki chakra as something that can break it, it will attempt to prevent the breaking. It will attack through the blood bond pathway. She held his gaze. The experience is, from what I understand from the original bondholders who survived similar processes, extremely unpleasant. Extremely unpleasant on what scale? On the scale of, she considered. It will feel like the seal is attempting to consume you from the inside. Using your own chakra pathways as a road inward, like a reverse seal. Like a very aggressive reverse seal, yes. He thought about it. He thought about the extraction attempts the Akatsuki had made, the feeling of Kurama being pulled from him, the specific invasive wrongness of something using your own body as a vector against itself. Kurama, he said aloud. I heard, the Ninetales said. I can shield the pathway. If the seal attempts to use your chakra network as ingress, I can create a counterforce at the network level. It won't be painless, but it won't consume you. My partner can help with that, he said to Kuraiheim. The Ninetales can operate defensively along my chakra pathways. It limits the seal's ability to turn my own body against me. She stared at him. You have a relationship with the Ninetales that allows cooperative internal defense. I told you we had an arrangement. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her adjusting something in her calculations. That changes the risk profile significantly, she said finally. I had intended to address the danger with. She trailed off in the specific way of someone who had been planning to offer something and is now reassessing whether to offer it. With what? He asked. She looked away. It was the first time she'd looked away from him in conversation. She'd maintained eye contact with the consistency of someone for whom direct engagement was a matter of principle. The brief aversion was small but legible. A blood bond, she said. Between us. A limited one. It would create a defensive connection that would allow me to brace the pathway from the outside while you broke the seal from the inside. She looked back at him. It carries implications I had intended to explain fully before proposing it. But if your internal defense is sufficient, it may not be necessary. He filed the offered blood bond in the back of his mind, flagged for later. We can see how it goes, he said. If I need external support at the binding seat, we discuss it then. She nodded once, with the relief of someone who had prepared for a complicated conversation and is satisfied to defer it. The walk to the approach route took 40 minutes through ravine systems that she navigated with the ease of 2 centuries of practice. She moved through the blackstone landscape like she was part of it, unhurried, deliberate, with the particular belonging of something that has inhabited a place for so long that the place has adapted to include it. He watched her move and thought about what she'd said over the map. 400 years of sovereignty, 200 years of displacement. She had spent a period of time being stripped of everything she'd built that was as long as Konoha had existed. Can I ask you something? He said. You've been asking me things freely for the past several hours, she said. I see no reason you'd request permission now. Fair. When Zagura took the anchor points, when you lost the sovereignty, did the demons who'd served under you, who shifted because of the chakra flow pull, did they? He tried to find the right word. Did it hurt? Watching them shift? She walked for a moment without answering. Then yes. Just the one word, with no elaboration and no emotion in the delivery. But the absence of elaboration meant more than expansion would have. Yeah, he said. I understand that. She glanced sideways at him. You've experienced loyalty lost to an external force. I've experienced loss in general, he said. People I cared about going away because of things bigger than either of us. He kept his voice level, the way he'd learned to. It's different from regular loss because there's no clear object to direct the grief at. The people didn't choose to leave. The situation moved them. She walked for several paces in silence. That is, she said finally, a remarkably precise description. I had a long time to think about it. The ravine opened ahead into a wider space, and she stopped at the edge where the ravine wall gave way to open terrain. In the distance, perhaps 2 kilometers through broken ground, a formation of rock rose that was different from the jagged natural formations elsewhere. This was structured, placed, with the deliberate regularity of something built or summoned. Around its base, faint lines of amber light traced patterns in the black earth that extended outward like roots. The anchor point. Tomorrow, she said, looking at it. Her chains shifted once, slowly, the way they did when she was feeling something she didn't intend to express. Tomorrow, he confirmed. She turned and headed back into the ravine, and he followed. And behind them the anchor point sat in the purple-gray light of the Ashen Realm, waiting to be reclaimed. That night, measured by Kurama's sense of the realm's energy cycle rather than by any observable change in the sky, they talked for a long time. Not about strategy. Not about plans. The plans were laid, and they were both people who understood the difference between productive preparation and anxious repetition. She told him about the Uzumaki clan's first contact with the Ashen Realm, which predated written Uzumaki history, and explained several things about his mother's chain technique that he hadn't previously understood. He told her about the war, less condensed than the version he'd given earlier, with more of the texture, the people he'd fought with, the ones he'd lost, the strange grief of surviving something that many hadn't. She listened in a way that very few people in his life had, without the weight of their own emotional response adding commentary, without the need to respond to each piece with something, without the subtle social pressure of an audience performing engagement. She simply listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she responded to the specific thing he'd said rather than to the general shape of the thing. It was, he realized, the way he preferred to be heard. At some point much later she said, "You understand that if this works, the anchor points, the binding seat, the reclamation, it will not be quick. Rebuilding sovereignty takes time even with the mechanics restored. How long until I can get back through the rift? After the binding seat, with the seal broken and my authority restored, I can open the rift from this side. 2 weeks at minimum, assuming the reclamation proceeds without severe complications." 2 weeks, he said. Are you needed urgently? He thought about it. He thought about Konoha, about the people there who would notice him gone. Shikamura would begin protocols. Kakashi, now retired but still well connected, would be informed. They'd be concerned, and the concern would be real, and there was nothing he could do about it from here. No emergency, he said. Not in 2 weeks. They'll worry, but they'll manage. She nodded. I'll get you home, she said, and the directness of it was the closest thing to a reassurance she'd offered him. I know, he said. And then, because it was accurate, I trust you. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Too layered, too much happening in it, compressed behind the default assessment face she wore like armor. That's unwise, she said. We met yesterday. I'm a pretty good judge of people, he said. I've been wrong before. But not often. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Ashen Realm continued its long, sourceless twilight, and the amber light in the rock veins above them pulsed slowly, and Naruto Uzumaki sat across from a 400-year-old demon queen who looked like his mother, and fought like a force of nature, and had spent 2 centuries surviving the loss of everything she'd built. Rest, she said finally. Tomorrow we take the first anchor point. He lay back on the flat stone and looked up at the amber-veined ceiling. Hey, he said. What? You're going to get your throne back. Another long silence. And then, so quiet he almost missed it. Yes, she said. I am, not loud in the way of jutsu exchanges, not the percussive boom of elemental techniques, or the sharp crack of bodies hitting earth. Loud in a deeper register, a sound that came up through the ground rather than across the air, like the realm itself was involved in what was happening, like each impact resonated in the black stone underfoot, and the bruised sky overhead, and the sourceless light that lay flat across everything. The second thing he noticed was that everything Kuraiheim had taught him was immediately, urgently necessary. They'd approached the first anchor point through the broken ground she'd scouted the previous cycle, moving low and chakra suppressed, taking the route that kept them below the natural sight lines of the formation's elevated edges. She moved like water through the terrain, no wasted motion, every step placed with the precision of someone who had walked this exact ground in her memory for decades and was now matching memory to reality. He followed her and tried not to think about how it felt to enter a fight with no backup. No shadow clones deployed as advanced scouts. No support formation of any kind. "You have me," Kurama said. "I know. I'm not worried." He paused. "I'm a little worried." "That's good. Appropriate. I'd be more concerned if you weren't." The anchor point's outer perimeter was marked by those extending lines of amber light he'd seen from the ravine edge, roots of illumination spreading outward from the central formation through the black earth, 50-60 meters in each direction. At the point where the light lines reached their farthest extent, they pulsed faintly. "Detection field?" he asked, just above a breath. "Passive," she murmured back. "Not a deliberate alarm system. The anchor point radiates its own awareness. Demonic entities within the field who are attuned to Zagura's chakra frequency will feel a pull, an alertness. The guards will be on the inner edge of that radius." "How many?" "When I last observed, 6. 2 on the formation itself, 4 on rotation in the perimeter." She crouched behind a low slab of black rock, and he crouched beside her. "The 2 on the formation are the priority. They'll have direct chakra contact with the anchor point. If they push an alert through that contact before we neutralize them, Zagura will know we're here faster than we'd like. Take them first." "Take them first," she confirmed. "I'll approach the formation from the north face. There's a blind spot in the rotation at the northwestern guard's turnaround point. I can reach the formation and clear the 2 direct contact guards before the rotators complete their cycle, and I handle the 4 on rotation." She turned and looked at him with the expression she used when she was about to say something careful. "All 4. In sequence, without alerting adjacent guards. In a realm where your combat style is new information and demonic opponents read emotional chakra fluctuation. You taught me how to compensate for most of that." "I taught you the theory," she said. "This will be the practice. That's kind of how learning works." She studied him for a moment, and he could see her doing the calculation, the assessment of whether he'd absorbed what she taught him well enough to stake the mission on it. He waited. He'd learned in about 24 hours that pushing Kuraihan toward conclusions she hadn't reached on her own was less effective than waiting for the conclusion to arrive. "There are 4 of them and 1 of you," she said finally. "Sure," he said. "But there's also an argument that there are 4 of me and 4 of them." She looked at him. "Shadow clone technique. Shadow clone technique. I know of it," she said. "Your world's intelligence on Konoha was thorough before the clan wars. A mass cloning technique developed from the Kage Bunshin." She tilted her head. "Your clones have substance, full physical presence. They run chakra independently, they fight independently, and when they dispel, all their sensory experience comes back to me. They read as individual chakra signatures. They read as identical individual chakra signatures," he said. "Which is confusing under ideal circumstances. In a perimeter rotation with 4 guards, 4 of me hitting simultaneously from angles that make individual response coordination difficult," he shrugged. "4 confused guards with similar response time is better than 4 guards who've had time to establish a defensive formation." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her not quite revise something. "Fine," she said. "But if you produce the clones inside the detection field, the anchor point will read the chakra multiplication as, I produce them outside the field and they enter with the same suppression I'm using," he said. "They're extensions of my chakra. I can run the suppression through them." She blinked. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it was the closest thing to startlement he'd seen from her. "You can extend active chakra suppression through clones. I've been told it's not something most people can do," he admitted. "Chakra control is kind of a thing for me." "Kind of a thing," she repeated, with a specific flatness that suggested she found the understatement somewhat aggravating. "We can have a conversation about my skill set after we take the anchor point," he said. "What's the signal when you're in position?" She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached out and her right hand found his left wrist, and she pressed 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist where the pulse ran close to the surface, and he felt a brief flare of her chakra, a distinct, non-threatening pulse, like a knock. That, she said? When I'm in position, you'll feel it. Move on that signal. Her fingers left his wrist. He was aware, peripherally, that his pulse had sped up slightly, which he attributed to pre-combat adrenaline and filed firmly in a folder marked not relevant right now. Got it, he said. She looked at him for one more breath, and then she was gone, moving low and fast into the terrain to the north, and within 4 seconds he couldn't see her anymore. He settled in behind the rock slab and exhaled slowly. Around him, the Ashen Realm sat in its eternal pre-storm light, and the amber lines of the anchor point's field pulsed at the edge of his vision. He formed 3 clones. The signal arrived 11 minutes later. A small, clean pulse of chakra against his inner wrist, felt through the air rather than touch, but the impression of her fingers was somehow still present in it, like a frequency he could tune to. He'd never experienced chakra communication quite like that before. He filed it, and moved. The 4 clones, himself plus 3, entered the detection field at 4 different points on the compass, perfectly simultaneous, suppressed down to near zero external chakra signature. The rotation guards were exactly where she'd said they'd be. The first was large, larger than any human opponent he'd faced, easily 2.5 meters, with limbs that had the structural density of stone and a body that moved with the specific slowness of something that had never needed to be fast because nothing had ever made it need to be. It was vaguely humanoid, with excess joints in its arms, and its eyes, 4 of them, in a vertical line down the center of its face, were closed. Resting state. Kurama's detection through the shared sensory space confirmed it was in minimal alertness. Naruto was 10 meters from it before the eyes opened. Not because it heard him. He was making no sound, disturbing no air, producing no chakra signal worth reading. It opened its eyes because the anchor point's field had shifted, and something at the edge of the guard's obligatory fealty awareness had registered. A sovereign presence was engaging at the formation. Kuraiheim had reached the direct contact guards. No more time for careful approach. He closed the 10 meters in 2 seconds and hit the guard with a Rasengan at the second thoracic junction, the demonic equivalent of the solar plexus. As she marked it in the dirt, and felt the rotational chakra grind through the dense body with a sound like granite splitting, the guard went down and stayed down. He was already moving. The second guard was 50 meters southeast, reacting to the formation disturbance, moving toward the north face with the mechanical urgency of obligatory fealty responding to a threat to its bound location. Clone 2 intercepted it from the east, hitting the junction she'd identified, and the guard dropped as cleanly as the first. 40 meters west, Clone 1. 20 meters north-northeast, Clone 3. He heard them connect through the shared sensory feedback. 2 impacts, 2 sounds of bodies hitting black earth, 2 confirmations of successful takedowns. 4 for 4. No alerts pushed through the anchor point. He stood in the sudden quiet of the outer perimeter and breathed. Then from the formation, he heard the chains. He ran toward the sound and arrived at the north face of the anchor point formation to find the aftermath of something he wished he'd seen in progress. The 2 direct contact guards had been significantly larger than the perimeter rotation units. They were pinned to the rock face of the formation with chains, full wraps, multiple times over, the chain links glowing amber where they intersected with the anchor point's own radiant field. Both guards were alive, immobilized, their bodies held with the specific thoroughness of someone who had been doing this for 4 centuries. Kuraiheim stood between them with her back to the formation, facing the open ground, chains extending from her wrists to the pinned guards behind her. She was breathing slightly harder than usual, not exhausted, but elevated. The guards had been larger than the perimeter units. She looked at him across the open ground. Then she looked at the 4 empty spaces where the perimeter guards had been, and back at him. Clean, she said. Yours too, he said, looking at the pinned guards. The eastern one was quicker than I remembered. She flexed her left hand slightly. He noticed for the first time a thin line along her forearm where the skin had been torn. Not deep, but real. She noticed him noticing. A graze. It's irrelevant. Does demonic physiology heal fast? Faster than human? Slower than you might want in a combat scenario. She turned toward the formation's central structure, a flat-topped column of black rock roughly 4 meters in diameter, its surface covered in those same amber light lines that spread outward into the terrain. Up close the lines were more complex than they'd appeared from a distance. layered, interlocking, forming patterns that had both mathematical regularity and something that felt organic, like the lines were growing rather than drawn. "This is it," she said. "The first anchor point. What do we do with it? I need to re-establish contact." She stepped toward it and stopped with her hands centimeters from the surface. "When Zagura broke my sovereignty, the anchor points weren't destroyed. They were rekeyed, his chakra frequency overlaid on mine. Reclaiming this one means pressing my frequency back in." She glanced at him. "It will hurt. Not the way the binding seat will hurt you. But it will hurt. Do you need me to do anything? Stand between me and anything that responds to the anchor point shifting." He positioned himself with his back to her, and his eyes on the approaches. "Go." He heard her press her palms to the stone, and then the sound came, not the distant ground resonance of the combat, but something deeper and larger, a sustained low tone that he felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears. The amber light in the formation flared, went white-gold, fluctuated between the two colors rapidly, and the lines spreading outward across the terrain pulsed and contracted and spread again. Behind him, her breathing changed. Not pain sounds, she was suppressing those, but the rhythm altered, shortened, became the rhythm of someone managing something significant. On the terrain, things moved. 3 demonic entities, mid-sized, appearing from the east at a hard run, drawn by the frequency shift, obligatory fealty pulling them toward the anchor point they were bound to. Naruto moved. The difference between fighting with and without Kuraiheim's 4 principles was immediate and total. Chakra suppressed, internal rather than radiating. The first entity charging toward him from the east didn't adjust its approach angle to compensate for an aggressive signal. It ran straight at the anchor point because that's what it was bound to do, and he intercepted it from the side rather than letting it pick a combat engagement angle on its own terms. He hit the thoracic junction and the entity went down, and he was already repositioning before the second one arrived. Second entity, larger, 3 meters, moving fast for its size. His instinct was to go high, get above the shoulder line, but she told him demonic entities of this size class had reinforced shoulder and neck structure that made overhead approaches tactically weak. He went low instead, dropped under the entity's swinging arm, planted a Rasengan into the lower torso junction, used its own momentum to drive the technique deeper into the impact. Down. Third entity stopped outside striking range and produced something that was not quite a weapon, a concentration of demonic chakra at its right forearm, solidified into something like a blade that extended half a meter beyond the arm's natural reach. A technique rather than a physical construct, and that meant it read in the chakra environment. He read the emotional signal she described. This one was afraid. Interestingly afraid. Not afraid of him, afraid of the anchor point shifting, of the sovereignty change it signaled, of what it meant for an entity running on obligatory fealty. The fear was existential and general, not combat-specific, and when he understood that, he adjusted his approach entirely. He stopped moving. He let his own chakra projection do something specific, not suppress, not radiate aggression, but express something closer to steadiness. The kind of thing Kurama could read and translate. The entity with the arm blade stopped. "It can feel that you're not a threat to it specifically," Kurama said. "The fear isn't about you. Stand down," Naruto said to the entity. It wouldn't understand his language, but the chakra said the same thing, and the chakra it could read. The entity looked at him. Then at the anchor point behind him, where the light was cycling between gold and white. Then back at him. It retracted the arm blade. It didn't leave. Its obligatory fealty kept it within the field, but it wasn't fighting. Naruto turned back toward the formation. Kuraiheim was on her knees, both palms still pressed to the anchor point surface, the chains tied around her wrists, the light in the formation a steady, sustained white gold that was neither the amber of Zagura's frequency nor the distinctive color of her own chakra, but something in between, the two frequencies fighting for dominance within the stone. Her head was bowed. Her breathing was completely controlled now, not with management but with the specific control of someone who has removed the option of not controlling it. "Kuraiheim," he said, "don't." Her voice was entirely even. "Don't break my concentration." He stood beside her and watched the light fluctuate. The sustained tone in his chest deepened, and he felt Kurama shift within him, not preparing for combat, just responding to the frequency. The way you adjust your balance on unsteady ground. The demonic chakra here is old, Kurama said quietly. Older than what she described. This anchor point has been in her sovereignty alignment for a long time. Zagura's overlay is recent by comparison. She's peeling it back. The light surged white. Then white gold. Then, a distinct, different color entirely, something he had no word for, a deep blue violet. The color of the sky at the exact moment before dawn existed, but after night was committed to ending, the tone in his chest resolved into something that was almost music. The light settled. The amber was gone. The blue-violet held, steady and clear, spreading outward from the formation through the lines in the black earth, the roots of illumination rewriting their frequency as they extended. Kuraiheim lifted her palms from the stone. She stayed on her knees for a moment, head still bowed, breathing slowly returning to baseline. He crouched beside her. Are you fine? She raised her head. Her face was composed, but there was something visible in her eyes that wasn't. The specific exposed quality of someone who has just experienced something that reached deep enough to bypass their defenses. I'm fine. The chain on her left wrist, the one above the graze from the Eastern Guard, was glowing faintly blue-violet where it crossed the wound. He didn't say anything. He crouched beside her and waited while she gathered herself, and she didn't tell him to move away, which he counted as something. After a moment she stood. He stood with her. One, she said, looking at the formation. One, he agreed. One more peripheral point, and then the binding seat. She looked at the entity that had retracted its arm blade. It was standing at the field's edge, still in the obligatory fieldy pull, but its demeanor had changed with the frequency shift. It was looking at the blue-violet light spreading through the ground lines with the specific attention of something feeling a familiar pull reassert itself. It will shift, she said quietly. When the frequency fully replaces Zagura's, the obligatory fealty will redirect. This one and the pin too. They'll be mine again. Will they remember choosing to be loyal to Zagura? No. Obligatory fealty doesn't retain decision memory. It responds to the current frequency. She paused. Whether that's a mercy or an injustice depends on who's asking. Does it bother you? He asked. That their loyalty isn't chosen? She was quiet for a long moment. It bothers me less than it once did, she said carefully. And more than I'd prefer. She turned from the anchor point and began moving back toward the ravine approach. Come, we should be clear of the perimeter before Zagura's bound entities elsewhere detect the frequency shift. He fell into step beside her. 3 hours later, by Kurama's cycle sense, they were back at the camp. She tended the graze on her arm with efficient, practiced motions using something from the stored supplies that smelled like copper and old fire. He watched her do it without offering help, which seemed to be the correct choice. You fought well, she said, not looking up from the wound. You sound surprised. I sound accurate, she said. I had a range of projections. You performed at the upper end. She finished with the wound and set the supplies aside. The entity you talked down rather than fighting, that was not in any of my projections. It was scared, he said. Fighting scared things unnecessarily seemed like a waste. It was a demonic entity bound by obligatory fealty to an enemy sovereign, she said. Most people in your position would have engaged it. Most people in my position aren't me. He said it without any particular ego, just the factual assessment of someone who knows their own tendencies. I don't fight things I don't have to fight. It was scared and it wasn't a threat. Now it's about to shift sovereignty alignment back to you. That's better than a fight would have been. She looked at him across the space of the camp with that layered expression. The calculation and the thing beneath the calculation and the thing beneath that. Sit down, she said. He sat. She moved to the center of the camp floor and turned to face him. Her chains uncoiled from their resting position around her wrists and spread outward, the ends lifting into the air around her. You said I taught you the theory today and the battle was the practice, she said. Now you teach me something. He looked at her. Right now. The application of new techniques requires repetition close to the initial learning for maximum retention. She looked at him steadily. You teach something in return for what I taught you. That's how partnerships function. Equal exchange. He understood that she was doing several things simultaneously. Decompressing from the anchor point's intensity through the discipline of practice, establishing the principle of mutual investment in the partnership, and genuinely wanting to learn something. He understood all three of these things and didn't comment on any of them. What do you want to learn? He asked. The Rasengan. He blinked. It's not a simple technique. It took me months. Tell me the principle. He thought about it. Rotation without a form. Pure rotational chakra, held in a sphere by will rather than by shape. No elemental nature, no directional intent, just the rotation itself, concentrated to a point. She absorbed that. Against demonic armor density, a sufficiently concentrated rotational impact at the thoracic junction would be more effective than linear force, by a lot. The rotation grinds rather than impacts. Dense materials resist impact. They don't resist being taken apart at the molecular level. She extended one hand palm up. A small sphere of her own chakra appeared above it, not rotational, but there, blue-violet, steady, contained. She looked at it. Show me the initiation. He moved to sit across from her. He formed a Rasengan in his right hand, the familiar sphere, perfect spiraling rotation, and held it out so she could observe the structure. She studied it with the same complete attention she gave to everything. He watched her eyes track the rotation, saw her feel the chakra output with the demonic chakra sensitivity he still couldn't fully access himself. The outer layer spins counter to the inner layer, she said. Yes. And the stability comes from the opposition between them rather than from external containment. Yes. That's the hard part. Most techniques generate chakra outward, one direction. The Rasengan generates chakra inward against itself. Your instincts work against you. She was quiet for a moment. Then the sphere of her chakra above her palm began to rotate. It was rough, ragged, collapsing twice before she found something approaching the right structure. Her expression didn't change. No frustration, no satisfaction, just the focused attention of someone working a problem. The third attempt held for 3 seconds before the rotation became unstable. The counter-rotation, she said. The inner layer resists. It always does at first. You're trying to get two opposing forces to coexist in the same space. How did you learn to stabilize it? I stopped trying to force the two layers to agree with each other, he said. I stopped thinking of them as opposites, and started thinking of them as parts of the same movement. He tried to find the right analogy. Like a wheel that's also an axle. The outer rotation and the inner rotation aren't fighting each other. They're expressing the same thing from different angles. She looked at him for a moment. That is a surprisingly useful description. I have my moments. The sphere above her palm reformed. This time the rotation began from the inside rather than the outside. He could feel it in the chakra environment, the small outward ripple of her technique's development. Counter-rotation asserted at the outer layer. Both layers ran together, not opposing, expressing the same spiraling motion from different angles. The sphere held. It was small, barely the size of a marble, and the blue-violet color was distinct from the pale blue of the technique as he performed it, her chakra frequency giving it a different signature. But the structure was correct. The rotation was correct. He stared at it. That took me 3 months of daily practice, he said. You are 19, she said. You had things competing for your attention. She dispelled the sphere and looked at her palm with the expression she used when recalibrating. I'll need to develop the scale. A marble-sized Rasengan is technically correct but operationally useless. Scale comes with practice, he said. But the structure, he gestured at her palm. You just did the hard part. Most people can't do the hard part in one session. I am not most people, she said. No, he said. You're really not. She looked up at him, and for a moment the calculation in her expression was entirely absent. Just the look itself, direct and open in a way that the rest of her presentation rarely was. It lasted for only a breath. Then the calculation returned and she stood. Rest, she said. The second anchor point is more exposed than the first. We'll need the full cycle. He lay back on the sleeping platform and looked at the amber veins in the ceiling. Kuraiheim, he said. What? You got the rotation right on the third try, he said. I want you to know I noticed that. Silence from the other side of the camp. Then, very quietly, in a voice she clearly calibrated to sound like it didn't matter. I know you noticed. He smiled at the ceiling and didn't push it further. The second anchor point was taken in the following cycle, with a different configuration of guards and a different configuration of problems. The guards here were faster and less predictably positioned than the first point's rotation units. One of them hit him hard enough to send him through a section of rock formation that had not been expecting to be hit with a human being at that velocity. He pulled himself out of the rubble with a split lip, and what was probably a bruised rib, and the genuine, clear-eyed acknowledgement that demonic combat was a significant adjustment. Kuraiheim appeared beside him as he was standing up, her chains retracting from 3 simultaneously pinned guards behind her. "You all right?" she asked. "Mostly." He touched his lip and looked at the blood on his finger. The fast one was, "Yes," she said. "I apologize. I underestimated its speed class." She looked at him with the particular expression she used when accounting for something she'd calculated wrong. "That's my error. You don't have to apologize." "Yes, I do," she said, simply and without drama. "I gave you faulty tactical information, and you took an impact because of it. That's an error, and I'm acknowledging it." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Thank you." She produced something from the pouches at her belt, a small container of the same copper-smelling salve she'd used on her own graze, and held it out. He took it and applied it to his lip. The effect was immediate, not painlessness, but something that made the pain irrelevant to function, a shunting aside rather than a removal. "Good," she said, assessing. "Nothing structural." "Nothing structural," he confirmed. She turned to the anchor point's formation and pressed her palms to it. He stood guard while the blue-violet frequency replaced the amber. This time she didn't go to her knees. This time he saw the exact moment the frequency crossed, saw it move in her face, something that arrived in her expression that he didn't have a word for but that he understood viscerally. Relief, he thought. Not the quick relief of a problem solved. The deep relief of something long owed finally being paid back. 2 anchor points. Hers. When she lifted her palms this time, she stood fully upright and turned to face the open terrain with the chains loose and calm at her wrists. "The binding seat," she said. "The binding seat," he said. Behind them, the second anchor point pulsed blue-violet into the black earth, and its lines of light reached outward through the ashen realm, rewriting the frequency of the ground as they spread. They didn't arrive together. They came in ones and twos, from different directions through different approaches, each one taking a route that suggested long practice at moving through a realm controlled by someone else's sovereignty. They arrived at the camp without fanfare, without announcement, and each one, upon entering, did the same thing. Looked at the blue-violet light now threading through the camp's stone floor from the 2 reclaimed anchor points, and went still for a moment with the specific stillness of something recognizing a frequency it had been a long time without. Naruto watched them arrive from a position near the camp's entrance, and tried not to make it obvious that he was cataloging everything. The first 2 were what he mentally classified as mid-class demonic entities, roughly human in silhouette, taller and denser, with the structural modifications he was getting better at reading. Reinforced joint clusters, 4-point visual arrays, hands with an extra opposable digit. They moved like soldiers, which he recognized because he'd been surrounded by soldiers most of his life, and they looked at Kuraiheim when they arrived with the kind of relief that people try to suppress because they've been suppressing it for a long time, and have gotten good at it, and aren't quite good enough. The third arrival was different. It was small, smaller than him, which surprised him, barely 160 centimeters, and covered in something that was either scaled armor or scaled skin, the distinction unclear. Its eyes were a solid amber that glowed faintly without the anchor point's light to explain it, and it moved with the specific contained energy of something that is always preparing for the next action. It looked at Naruto immediately and didn't look away. Kuraiheim said something to it in the demonic language. It responded without breaking eye contact with Naruto. She responded again, and this time the small entity tilted its head slightly, and said something that had a question shape to it. "What's it asking?" Naruto said. Kuraiheim said. "And she's asking if you're afraid of her." Naruto looked at the small entity with the amber eyes. "Not particularly," he said. Kuraiheim translated. The entity, she, looked at him for another moment, and then made a sound he would later learn was approximately equivalent to a satisfied grunt, and moved past him into the camp. "That's Sari," Kuraiheim said. "She has been with me for 300 years. She is the best tactician I have. She's the size of a genin." "Size is a poor metric in this realm," Kuraiheim said. "You've learned that." He had. By the time the 8th arrival settled into the camp, Naruto had revised his assessment of the 11 upward from loyal survivors to the most specific collection of individuals he had ever encountered in one place. There was Sari, the small tactician. There were the 2 mid-class soldiers he'd seen first, who he learned were called Veth and Karu and who functioned as a paired combat unit with a synchronized fighting style that had been 2 centuries in development. There was a large entity, the largest he'd encountered so far, nearly 4 meters when standing fully upright, named Doru, who communicated primarily through Kuraiheim's translation and appeared to be more interested in the structural quality of the camp's rock walls than in Naruto specifically, which he found oddly comfortable. There was a female entity with elongated limbs and eyes that moved independently of each other who was introduced only as the scholar, and who immediately, upon arrival, went to examine the map table with the focused disregard for social convention of someone who considers information more urgent than introductions. And there were others, arriving in the slow steady trickle that ended with the final 2 coming in together from the south just as the realm's long cycle approached what Kurama identified as its midpoint. The final 2 were different from the others in a way he noticed before he could articulate it. They were young. Not young in the demon sense, he had no reference for that, but young in the sense of still developing, still arriving at their own weight. The first was slightly built with hair the color of old copper and eyes that flickered between amber and something darker. The second was taller, broader, with a stillness that seemed deliberate, like something being carefully maintained. Kuraiheim greeted them with a hand briefly on each of their shoulders, a contact she hadn't made with any of the other arrivals, and which they received with the specific ease of long familiarity. She didn't introduce them immediately. She finished the greeting and then looked across the camp at Naruto with a slight tilt of her head that meant come here. He crossed the camp and stood in front of the 2 younger demons. These are Yoru and Rin, she said. They joined me 40 years ago. A pause. They were orphaned by Zagura's expansion. He destroyed their previous sovereign's territory to consolidate the northern reaches. Her voice was level. I found them. He looked at the 2 of them. The copper-haired one, Yoru, was looking back at him with a directness that reminded him, painfully and specifically, of Konoha, of the way kids who'd grown up hard looked at adults before they'd decided whether the adult was trustworthy. Hey, Naruto said. Yoru kept looking at him. Then said something in the demonic language. Kuraiheim translated. She says you don't look like someone who survived Kagaya Atsutsuki. Naruto smiled. He couldn't help it. I get that a lot too, he said. Kuraiheim translated. Yoru's expression shifted slightly, not a smile, but the movement toward one. Rin, the taller one, said nothing. But his stillness became slightly less deliberate. Sari ran the tactical briefing. She did it from the map table, using a combination of the demonic language and gestures that were readable across the language gap, occasionally enlisting Kuraiheim to translate the points specific to Naruto. The others gathered around the map in a configuration that made it clear this was familiar practice. They'd done this together before, not in this camp but in principle. The 11 of them planning and recalibrating and planning again for 2 centuries. The approach to the binding seat, Sari established, was the most exposed terrain they would face. Unlike the anchor points, which sat in fixed locations with predictable guard patterns, the binding seat was at the convergence point of all 5 anchor points' chakra networks. It wasn't a building or a formation, it was a location, a point in the terrain where the realm's deep structural chakra was most concentrated, where the lines spreading from all 5 points intersected, and Zagura knew it. He had a fortress 3 kilometers from the binding seat. He had his primary forces there. He had been watching the binding seat for 2 centuries with the confidence of someone who has removed the only meaningful threat to its security, and is now simply maintaining. He knows about the anchor points by now, Kuraiheim said, when Sari reached the point in the briefing that addressed this. The frequency shift will have registered. He knows I took them. She paused. What he doesn't know is how. Sari said something short and sharp. Kuraiheim translated. He knows you don't have Uzumaki support. The clan is gone. He'll assume a demonic technique, which means he's recalibrating his defenses against demonic approaches, Naruto said. Kuraiheim looked at him. Yes, and we're not using demonic approaches, not entirely. She looked at the map. Sari's plan is a split approach. 9 of the 11 engage Zagura's fortress directly, not to breach it, but to occupy his primary forces. Keep them committed to defense. That draws attention, draws chakra resources, and creates the window. And while the 9 have his attention, you, Veth, Karu, and I move to the binding seat. She traced the route on the map. It was indirect, using terrain features that provided concealment, hugging the geography in a way that made it invisible from the fortress's elevated sight lines. The approach takes 45 minutes at a committed pace. We have approximately that long before Zagura realizes his fortress isn't the primary target and redirects. 45 minutes to reach the binding seat, Naruto said. How long does the seal breaking take? She looked at him steadily. I don't know precisely. It's never been done. The theory suggests between 10 and 20 minutes of sustained contact, so we're working with a window of 20 minutes maximum before Zagura potentially redirects forces to the binding seat. Yes. And if he redirects before we're done, then Veth and Kuro hold the perimeter while we finish. She said it with a simplicity that acknowledged what holding a perimeter against the redirected demon lord's primary forces actually meant. Naruto looked at the map. He thought about what Sari had laid out, about the geometry of it. The 9 drawing attention to the north, the 4 moving to the center, the window created by the diversion. The 9 need to make it convincing, he said. If Zagura thinks it's a distraction, he pulls forces immediately. Sari said something without being prompted. Kuraiheim translated with something in her expression that might have been quiet pride. She says they have been making 2 centuries of distraction look convincing. She asks that you extend them the appropriate credit. He looked at Sari, who was looking back at him with amber eyes that didn't miss anything. Noted, he said. My apologies. Sari made the sound he'd learned was a satisfied grunt, and moved on to the next section of the briefing. Before they moved, Kuraiheim took him aside. The camp had filled with the particular energy of a group preparing for something significant, the careful, quiet energy of people checking and rechecking, conversations in low tones, the whole body attentiveness that precedes a commitment you can't reverse. She brought him to the back of the camp, near the section of wall that caught the most of the emberstone glow, and faced him with her hands at her sides and her chains and resting coils and her expression doing the thing where the calculation was present but something beneath it was also present, and not being hidden. I want to tell you something, she said, before we approach the binding seat. Okay, he said. The seal breaking, she said. When your blood makes contact with Zagura's core seal, the seal will recognize the Uzumaki frequency, and it will respond. I told you it will attempt to use your chakra pathways as ingress. She paused. What I didn't fully explain is what that means experientially. He waited. It will show you things, she said. The seal is built on blood bond architecture, and blood bond architecture accesses the memory embedded in the blood. The Uzumaki line has a long history of connection to the Ashen realm, longer than most living knowledge preserves. That history is in your blood. When the seal engages with your blood, it will pull those memories up as a defense mechanism. She held his gaze. They won't be your memories. They'll feel like yours. He absorbed that. How bad? I don't know. The depth of the memory pull depends on the depth of the seal's desperation. A seal fighting to prevent its own breaking will use everything available to it. She looked at him carefully. It may show you things about your bloodline that are difficult. Things about your mother's choices, the choices of her predecessors. The history of the Uzumaki connection to the Ashen realm was not without cost. To them or to the realm? Both. A pause. I want you to know beforehand because experiencing it without context is disorienting in a way that interferes with maintaining the contact needed to complete the breaking. If you know it's coming, I can stay in it without breaking off, he said. Yes. He nodded slowly. What else? She was quiet for a moment. Then, nothing else that can be prepared for. She looked at him with the particular directness of someone choosing to be fully honest about something. I need you to understand that I'm asking you to do something that will be painful and disorienting and that I cannot protect you from entirely. And I'm asking you to do it for my throne. You're not just asking me for your throne, he said. Zagura's been expanding. His territory has been growing toward the rift points. He already had the rift into the forest of death destabilized enough that I fell through it accidentally. If he keeps expanding, that's not just a demon realm problem. She looked at him. You figured that out. The rift I fell through wasn't natural. The forest of death doesn't just develop dimensional rifts. Something was pushing at the boundary from this side. He looked at her steadily. I'm not doing this just for you. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop framing it as a favor I'm doing you. She was quiet for a long breath. Then, you are very strange, she said. For a human. I get that one constantly, he said. Something in her expression shifted. That quick, almost hidden thing that he'd learned to read as the emotion she didn't intend to show being momentarily visible. This time it was something warmer than he'd seen before, and it lasted slightly longer than the previous times. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers to his inner wrist, the way she had before the first anchor point. A pulse of her chakra, the signal shape he'd memorized. That's still what I'll use, she said. When I'm ready at the binding seat. You'll feel it and you'll make contact. Got it. She held the 2-finger contact for a moment longer than she had before. He felt the blue-violet frequency of her chakra, distinct and old and complex, and he felt Kurama acknowledge it from within. Not with words but with a low awareness, a recognition. She let go. Turned back toward the camp and the 11 waiting in it. Let's go take back a throne, he said. She walked forward and didn't respond, which he was starting to understand meant she agreed but preferred not to say so. The approach to the binding seat took 43 minutes. He moved with Kuraiheim and Veth and Kura through terrain that became increasingly charged the closer they got to the convergence point. The amber and blue-violet conflict of the realm's current divided sovereignty was visible in the ground lines. Sections that had shifted to her frequency running up against sections still locked in Zagura's. The border between them pulsing and irregular, like a wound in the earth that hadn't decided whether it was going to heal or worsen. 3 kilometers to the north, the sound of the Nine's engagement with Zagura's fortress reached them as a sustained, low percussion. The ground resonance of high-level demonic combat, familiar now, felt in the chest and the soles of the feet rather than heard with the ears. It was loud enough to know it was working. Loud enough to know the Nine were not holding back. He thought about Seri, the small tactician with the amber eyes, leading 9 demons against a fortified position as a diversion. He thought about Yoru and Rin, the 2 youngest, in that 9. He filed the thought under trust the plan and kept moving. The binding seat was not what he'd expected. He'd built up an image in his head of something significant looking, a formation, a structure, some visible indication of the deep ceiling work it contained. What they arrived at was a depression in the black earth, roughly circular, perhaps 3 meters in diameter, where the ground lines from all 5 anchor points converged. The convergence point itself was about 30 centimeters below the surrounding terrain, as if the earth had settled under the weight of what ran through it. In the depression, the lines of chakra, amber on the 3 sides connected to Zagura's points, blue-violet on the 2 connected to Kuraiheim's reclaimed points, met at the exact center and became something else entirely. A color that was either a deep crimson that pulsed with the specific rhythm of a heartbeat, the binding seat, the realm's deepest seal. Zagura's core technique. Veth and Kura took positions on the approaches without instruction, north and south, covering the sight lines toward the fortress, bodies low and still and ready. They didn't look at the binding seat, they looked outward. This was their function, and they understood it completely. Kuraiheim stood at the edge of the depression and looked down at the crimson center. He stood beside her. How much time do we have? He asked. The engagement has been running for 7 minutes. We have perhaps 30 before Zagura can establish that his fortress is not the primary target. Add 5 for him to redirect and reposition forces. She looked at the convergence point. 35 minutes maximum. Then let's use 20 and leave 15 for margin, he said. How do I do this? You step into the depression, she said. You go to the center. You press your hand to the convergence point, and you push Uzumaki chakra through your blood into the seal. She paused. Not technique chakra, blood chakra. The base level frequency of your actual bloodline. He looked at her. I don't know how to consciously access blood level chakra. You do, she said. You've been doing it since you arrived here. The reason the rift didn't kill you, the reason demonic entities respond to you differently than they should respond to a human. That's the Uzumaki blood frequency expressing itself in an environment that can read it. You've been broadcasting it unconsciously since the moment you arrived. He stared at her. You knew that and didn't tell me? You hadn't needed to know it, she said. You needed to know the combat principles. Now you need to know this. She held his gaze. To access it consciously, go to the base of your chakra network, beneath the trained layers, beneath Kurama's integration, beneath the sage techniques. The layer that was there before you learned anything. That's the blood frequency. She's right, Kurama said. I can feel it. It's been active since the crossing. I've been aware of it, but it didn't seem relevant to mention. You could have mentioned it. You were busy learning to fight demons. He took a breath and stepped into the depression. The ground under his feet changed immediately. The black earth of the surrounding terrain was hard, compressed, solid with age. The earth inside the depression was different, not soft, not loose. But aware was the word that came to him, aware in the way that the anchor point formations had been aware, like the terrain here had a relationship with what moved through it. He walked to the center and crouched. Up close, the crimson convergence point had depth to it, not a surface marking but something that went down, how far he couldn't tell, like a well filled with red light instead of water. He pressed his right hand to it. The first thing was the cold. Not physical cold. He'd been cold before, in missions and training and the specific misery of winter in the mountains north of Konoha. And this was not that. This was the cold of something vast and old pressing against the edges of a boundary that existed for a reason. And the boundary was him, and it wanted inside. Kurama moved immediately. He felt the Nine-Tails chakra brace across his network like a physical thing, a reinforcement running along every pathway. And the cold hit it, and was held. Good, Naruto thought, stay with me. Where else would I go? Kurama said, and the dryness of it was the most comforting thing he'd felt since he fell through the rift. The second thing was the memories. They arrived not gradually but all at once, a superimposition over his own awareness so complete that he had to remind himself, actively, deliberately, repeatedly, that he was Naruto Uzumaki, 19, crouching in a depression in the Ashen Realm with his hand on a core seal, and that what was coming through the blood frequency was not his experience, but the record of the blood itself. The Uzumaki clan's history of contact with the Ashen Realm was not a clean history. He saw it in fragments that were less like watching and more like being, each one arriving with full sensory weight. A woman with red hair and a bearing that was somehow both Kushina and not Kushina. Standing at a rift the Ashen Realm was pushing through her world, pushing it closed with chains that ran gold-white at tremendous cost. A man with the Uzumaki spiral on his back arguing in a language that wasn't quite any language Naruto knew, arguing with a presence that was Kuraiheim but younger, the calculation in her eyes still forming. A child 7, 8 years old, with Uzumaki red in her hair and a blood bond mark already on her wrist, looking at the Ashen Realm through an open rift and not being afraid. And more. Deeper. Older than the clan itself, the first contact, the moment someone in his blood lineage had first made the connection that created the bond. The sensation of that moment was the most vivid of all. A young woman in a forest that was simultaneously the forest of death and not, standing at the edge of a shimmer in the air, and reaching out, and the shimmer reaching back, and both of them understanding simultaneously that something permanent was beginning. The seal responded to his access of these memories by doing exactly what Kuraiheim had warned. It inverted. It tried to follow the blood frequency back along the pathway, using the memories as a road into him, and Kurama hit it with a counterpressure so immediate and so precise that Naruto had approximately half a second of invasive wrongness before the Nine-Tails closed the pathway to ingress. Push now, Kurama said. While it's reorienting from the block, he stopped receiving and started sending. The blood frequency, the layer beneath everything, older than training, older than Jinchuriki, the base Uzumaki note that the Ashen Realm had been reading since he arrived. He pushed it consciously through his hand and into the crimson convergence point with everything he had. The crimson pulsed. Resisted. Pulsed again. He felt Kuraiheim move at the edge of the depression. Her 2 fingers on his wrist, from outside the boundary, not the signal, something else. Her chakra coming in along the blood bond pathway they'd established when they agreed to be partners, not entering him but running alongside his frequency, reinforcing it from outside the network rather than within. She'd said a blood bond might not be necessary if Kurama's internal defense was sufficient. She'd done it anyway. The crimson pulsed white. Then gold. Then, the seal broke. It didn't happen dramatically. It happened the way something fundamental changes. not with a sound or a light or a concussive force, but with a sudden change in the quality of everything. The resistance he'd been pushing against simply wasn't there. The crimson light in the convergence point pulsed once, hard, and then, between one heartbeat and the next, became the blue-violet of Kuraiheim's frequency, her sovereignty, her 4 centuries of rightful authority flowing back into the ground it had been stripped from. He lifted his hand. She was standing at the edge of the depression with both arms extended slightly from her body and her head back and her eyes closed, and the blue-violet light was rising from the ground through the convergence point and spreading, faster than it had from the individual anchor points, spreading in every direction at once, rewriting the realm's ground frequency from its deepest root outward. Zagura's amber was retreating. Not replaced, retreating, the way something retreats when the authority underpinning it has been dissolved. Naruto climbed out of the depression and stood beside her, watching the light spread. From the north, the percussion of the Nine's engagement with the fortress changed character. He could hear it without understanding it, but the change was legible. What had been a sustained attack pattern became something more chaotic, less organized. A fortress defense falling apart at the authority level. The chains at Kuraiheim's wrists were blazing blue-violet. Not controlled, not directed, just expressing themselves, the way they'd expressed when she'd reclaimed the first anchor point, but more so, fully, without the residual amber of Zagura's interference. She was all herself again. Whatever part of her sovereignty had been pressed down for 2 centuries was present, and the chains knew it before she opened her eyes. She opened her eyes. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the moment didn't already contain. She looked down at the convergence point, at the blue-violet center of all 5 anchor points' convergence. And then she looked out at the realm spreading around them under a sky that was shifting color for the first time since he'd arrived. The deep bruised purple lightning, the red at the horizon becoming something warmer, something that might, eventually, look like dawn. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. It was 2 words, and she said them with the particular weight of someone who does not use those words easily, who has chosen them because they are the accurate ones and for no other reason. "Partners," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Partners," she said. From the north, the percussion of battle changed again, resolving this time into the distinct silence of a fight that has ended because one side has lost the authority to continue it. Veth and Karu on the approaches turned from their watch positions and looked toward the convergence point. Their expressions were different from any expression he'd seen on a demonic entity yet. It was, he realized, the expression of someone coming home. In the distance, just visible through the gap in the rock spires, the fortress that had been Zagura's was still standing. But the amber light at its foundations had gone entirely dark. Zagura himself didn't surrender. He fled, which Kuraiheim anticipated and said so, without triumph, when Seri's report came back through the 11th communication network an hour after the binding seat broke. The Demon Lord was old and his power was real, and the loss of sovereign authority was not the same as the loss of personal capability. He was gone, and would need to be dealt with eventually, and she said that with the same patient, long-game certainty that she said everything that fell under the category of not today's problem. The 9 met them at the fortress's outer boundary with the marks of a serious fight on all of them, and Seri's amber eyes scanning him and Kuraiheim with the assessing completeness that he was learning to find reassuring. Yoru and Rin were standing together at the back of the 9, both intact and both wearing the expression of people who had done something hard and were still integrating it. He walked over to them. Yoru looked at him with the copper-haired directness he'd seen at the camp. Said something in the demonic language. He looked at Kuraiheim, who had followed him. "She says the fortress had 40 of Zagura's primary force," Kuraiheim translated. 9 to 40. "She wants to know if you're impressed." He looked at Yoru. "Yeah," he said. "I'm impressed." When Kuraiheim translated, something in Yoru's expression finally, fully opened. Not the movement toward a smile this time. The smile itself. Rin, beside her, unfolded some of his deliberate stillness, and Naruto thought that was probably as expressive as Rin got and respected it accordingly. The fortress stood dark and quiet around them, and the realm sky was a color he'd never seen before, the bruised purple fully gone now, replaced by something that might have been deep blue if given long enough to finish the change it had started when the binding seat broke. Kuraiheim stood at the center of the 11, and the chains at her wrists ran blue-violet light into the evening, and the realm that had been taken from her for 2 centuries received her sovereignty back into its ground with the slow, massive reliability of something returning to its natural state. She would need to hold court. She would need to negotiate, manage, consolidate. The 11 would expand as the realm's entities felt the frequency shift and processed what it meant. There would be problems he couldn't anticipate, and she'd been anticipating for decades. But the throne was hers, and the rift home needed 2 weeks to prepare. He looked at the sky. This new color he had no word for, this not yet dawn blue spreading across a realm that had forgotten it could look like anything other than bruised purple, and thought about the conversation he'd had with her on the first night, about surviving the loss of everything you'd built, about the specific grief that had no clear object. She appeared beside him, as she had a way of doing, movement he should have heard and somehow never quite did. 2 weeks, she said. Not a question. A statement of what came next. 2 weeks, he confirmed. She stood beside him and looked at the changing sky, and the blue deepened, and somewhere behind them Sari was already talking tactics to anyone who would listen, and Veth and Kura were doing the thing where they communicated in near silence. And Yora was looking at the sky too with an expression that was newly, carefully, hopeful. I'll show you the rest of the realm, Kuraiheim said. In the time that remains. Things that are worth seeing. I'd like that, he said. She nodded once. Didn't move away. He didn't either. The sky continued its long, slow journey toward the color it was becoming, and neither of them said anything about the fact that 2 weeks suddenly felt like both plenty of time, and not quite enough. The 2 weeks passed the way good things pass, faster than they should have, and with the specific quality of time that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you look back at it, and realize you weren't watching carefully enough while it was happening. He had watched carefully. He made a point of it. Kuraiheim had said she would show him things worth seeing, and she had, with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything. She took him through the Ashen Realm's geography with the patience of someone who had spent 4 centuries learning a place and understood the difference between knowing a map and knowing a landscape. She showed him the ember fields in the realm's western reaches, where the ground itself ran hot and the air above it shimmered with visible chakra currents that moved like weather. She showed him the pale caverns in the north, enormous underground spaces where bioluminescent organisms had been growing in undisturbed darkness since before any human history he knew, their light a cold blue that reflected endlessly in the calcite formations overhead. She showed him her court, reassembled. It happened slowly, the way she'd said it would, entities drifting back toward her sovereignty as the frequency restored itself through the realm, the obligatory fealty pull redirecting, the deliberate loyalists returning with the relief of something long held finally released. Within the first week the court had grown from 11 to 40. By the end of the second week it was over 100, with more arriving daily. She managed it with the competence of someone who had been doing it for centuries and the specific attentiveness of someone who understood that this particular restoration was more fragile than it looked. She held court each day with the 11 at her back, dealt with territory disputes and sovereignty questions and the long administrative tale of 2 centuries of Zagura's mismanagement with a patience that surprised him. He'd expected the imperiousness, the command presence, the absolute certainty of authority. He hadn't expected the patience. He told her that at the end of the first week. She looked at him over the map table where she was documenting a territory boundary resolution and said, "Impatience is a luxury of people who have enough time to be careless with it." He thought about that for a while. He spent his own days split between helping with the court's reassembly where he could be useful, which was more often than he'd expected. His ability to read and respond to demonic chakra had developed quickly in the active environment, and several of the territory disputes involved boundary claims where his neutral party chakra reading was cleaner than any invested demonic entities. And working with Sari and Veth and Kura on a systematic documentation of the Ashen Realm's defensive weaknesses relative to Zagura's probable approach on return. Zagura hadn't been found. That particular problem sat at the back of every conversation like a quiet weight. He was old and capable and stripped of sovereignty but not of personal power, and his absence was more concerning than his presence would have been because absence meant planning. He spent evenings with Kuraiheim, not by design, initially. The first 3 evenings it was because there were things to discuss: the court's progress, the defensive documentation, the rift timeline. Then it became something else, less structured, the continuation of the conversation that had started on the first night, and had never quite stopped. They talked about history, hers, his, the places where they intersected unexpectedly. She told him about the Uzumaki clan's founding generation with a first-hand specificity that made him sit very still and listen without interrupting, which was not his natural mode. He told her about the war in the detail he hadn't given anyone outside the people who'd been in it. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without the social performance of listening, and responded to the specific things he said rather than the general shape of them. On the 9th night she told him about the period just before Zagura's coup, and he understood for the first time that she'd been alone in a specific way long before the displacement. That 4 centuries of sovereignty had created a particular kind of isolation that had nothing to do with loneliness in the ordinary sense, and everything to do with the distance that authority creates between the person who holds it and everyone else. He didn't say I understand that immediately. He held it for a day and let it sit with what he already knew about her. On the 10th night he said, "You've been alone for longer than just the 2 centuries. She'd been quiet for a moment. Then yes. He nodded. Didn't push it further. She looked at him sideways in the emberstone light and said unprompted, "You have been too." Despite being surrounded by people constantly. He thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I have." They'd sat with that for a while, the two of them, in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over 10 days of consistent proximity, and the amber veins in the ceiling had pulsed slowly overhead, and neither of them said the things they weren't saying. On the 14th day, they went to the rift site. He'd been back once since arriving, in the first week, to check the location and confirm it was stable. It was in the same place, the convergence point where the boundary between the Ashen Realm and the Shinobi world was thin enough for passage. With Kuraiheim's sovereignty restored, the rifts that Zagura had been pushing against from this side had stabilized. The Forest of Death rift was no longer a wound being forced open but a natural thinness in the boundary, the kind that had probably existed in some form since the first Uzumaki blood bond was established. She had spent 2 days preparing the opening. It required sovereign authority and the specific blood bond connection to the rift location, the same connection that had been used in the original Uzumaki demon realm compact, she explained, a consensual pathway between the 2 worlds that could be opened and closed from either side. Zagura's 2-century effort to force rifts had been working against this architecture rather than with it. Working with it, which her restored sovereignty allowed, should have been straightforward. Should have been. The rift site was a flat section of black earth near the realm's eastern boundary where the ground lines ran particularly thin. You could see the faint shimmer of the other side through them if you looked from the right angle, the shimmer he'd fallen through 2 weeks ago. She stood at the center of the site with her palms down, and her chains extended into the earth, running the sovereign frequency through the boundary architecture, and he stood 6 meters back and watched the shimmer intensify. It intensified. It brightened. The air above the thinning ground began to do the heat haze shimmer he'd seen from above when he'd first noticed it in the Forest of Death. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not a slow failure of the technique. It simply stopped, at the threshold, like a door that had swung open to its limit, and refused to pass it. She stood upright and looked at the shimmer. Her chains retracted. Her expression was controlled, but he'd learned to read what control cost her, and this was costing something. "What happened?" he asked. "The boundary architecture." She paused, choosing her words with unusual care. The compact that established this rift pathway required a blood bond from both sides, the Uzumaki side and the Ashen Realm's sovereign side. When the Uzumaki line broke its connection 200 years ago, the pathway became one-sided. She looked at the shimmer. "I can open the door from this side to the boundary. But the boundary itself requires the compact architecture to complete the passage. Without a blood bond from the Uzumaki side, I can open it to the threshold but not through it." He stared at the shimmer. "You're saying the rift needs an Uzumaki blood bond to complete the opening?" "Yes. And I'm the Uzumaki." "Yes. So I need to form a blood bond to open the rift home." A pause. "Yes." He heard everything she wasn't saying in that pause and in the careful steadiness of her voice. He looked at her profile, the controlled expression, the chains slightly tighter at her wrists than their resting coil, and he understood what this moment cost her to present to him as simply as she was presenting it. "A blood bond is permanent," he said. "Yes. You knew this was a possibility, he said. When we talked about the rift requirements in the first days, you said you could open the rift home. You didn't say it might require this. I thought the sovereign restoration would be sufficient, she said, and her voice was absolutely level. The compact architecture should have been accessible through my sovereignty alone once the seal was broken. I was wrong. She looked at him directly. I'm telling you that clearly. I was wrong, and the situation is different from what I described, and you have every right to be. I'm not angry, he said. She stopped. I'm not angry, he said again. I'm trying to understand what we're working with. He looked at the shimmer. Tell me what a blood bond actually means. Not the mechanics. What it means. She was quiet for a moment. It means a permanent connection between our chakra systems at the blood frequency level. It cannot be severed voluntarily. It fades only with the death of one of the bondholders, and even then the residue persists. She paused. It is what my 11 carry with me. What Veth and Kirill have with each other. It is the oldest form of connection in the Ashen realm. Does it have effects? He asked. On day-to-day function? Awareness, she said. A background sense of the other person's general state. Not thoughts, not specific emotions, but presence. Whether they're in distress. Whether they're far away or close. She looked at him. You would carry that awareness of me. I would carry it of you. For the rest of your life. He absorbed that. And mine is shorter than yours. Significantly. Her voice didn't change. I'm aware of that. He was quiet for a long moment. The shimmer at the rift site continued its incomplete opening, waiting at the threshold. Naruto, she said, and his name in her mouth. The Ashen Realm inflection she'd developed for it over 2 weeks, slightly front-weighted. The final vowel, given more length than a human speaker would give it, had a quality that it hadn't had in the first days. Something that had grown in it. I am not asking you to form the blood bond. I know you're not asking. If you need to find another way. Is there another way? She was quiet for a moment. Not that I can identify. I have been trying to identify one since I confirmed the compact architecture this morning. She paused. I would rather keep trying than ask you to make a permanent commitment on the basis of 2 weeks. He looked at her. Can I ask you something? Yes. The blood bond that you almost proposed at the binding seat, he said. Before you pulled back because you thought Kurama's internal defense might be sufficient. Were you pulling back because of the mechanics or because of the permanence? She looked away from him. The second time she looked away in conversation, and he marked it the same way he marked the first, as the specific tell of someone encountering a question they hadn't prepared for. Both, she said. Partially both. Which was larger? A long pause. The permanence, she said. It wasn't a fair thing to propose to someone I'd known for 3 days. It's not a fair thing to propose to someone you've known for 2 weeks either, he said. No, she said. It isn't. He nodded. He looked at the shimmer. He thought about Konoha, about the people waiting for him there. Shikamaru would have initiated search protocols by now. Kakashi would have been consulted. The village was almost certainly running a missing need assessment on him. They were managing, as he told her they would, but they weren't unaffected, and the longer he was gone the more resource was being spent on locating him. He thought about the Uzumaki blood frequency he'd accessed at the binding seat, about the woman he'd seen in the blood memories reaching toward a shimmer in the air, and the shimmer reaching back, and both of them understanding that something permanent was beginning. He thought about 10 days of evenings and the conversation that hadn't stopped, and the way she listened, and the way she'd pressed 2 fingers to his wrist at the binding seat, not because it was necessary but because she'd decided to anyway. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want you to let me finish before you respond. She turned back to face him. All right. I've spent most of my life trying to connect with people, he said. Not because it came easily, it didn't, for a long time. Because I understood that connection was the thing. The most important thing. I made bonds with people who were supposed to be my enemies, and those bonds changed both of us. I have a tail beast living inside me who is my friend, who I trust completely, who I went from being terrified of to trusting my life to, because the connection turned out to be more real than the opposition we started with. He held her gaze. I've been in the Ashen Realm for 2 weeks, and you're not a stranger to me. You haven't been a stranger since about the 3rd day. She didn't say anything. Her expression was doing the complicated thing. all the layers present simultaneously. A blood bond is permanent, he said. Okay. I've made permanent commitments before. I've promised people things I knew I'd spend my whole life honoring. The permanence isn't the problem. He paused. The question I have is whether you want this. Not whether you need it for the rift. Whether you, Kuraheim, for 100 years old, sovereign of the Ashen Realm, who has been alone in a specific way for longer than just the 2 centuries, whether you want a permanent connection with a 19-year-old human who has about 50 or 60 years left if he's lucky and stays out of trouble, which he won't. The silence that followed was the longest silence he'd experienced with her, and he'd been with her for 2 weeks. Then she said, "That's an extraordinarily unfair question to ask me." "I know," he said. "I'm asking it anyway." She looked at him for a very long time. The shimmer at the rift site pulsed slowly behind him, incomplete at its threshold. The realm around them was quiet. They'd come alone, deliberately. This wasn't court business. "Yes," she said finally. "For the record, which I'm providing because you asked directly and I'm not willing to be indirect about this. Yes. I want it. I have been not wanting to want it for approximately 10 days and I've been unsuccessful." She held his gaze with the absolute directness of someone who has committed to honesty and intends to follow through. "But I want to be clear that you don't have to want it for the same reasons. You can want it because it's the only path home, and that can be sufficient." "I don't need, Kuraheim," he said. "What? You talked for longer than you usually talk." She stopped. "I want it for the same reasons," he said. The shimmer at the rift site pulsed again, and the blue-violet light in the ground lines of the Ashen Realm ran bright under the new sky that had been finding its color since the binding seat broke, and Kuraheim stood in front of him with 4 centuries in her eyes and the chains at her wrists perfectly still for the first time since he'd met her. "Then we're both being idiots," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "I have a good record with those." The blood bond ceremony was not elaborate. She described it during the walk back to court. Practical, brief, no ritual requirement beyond the blood frequency contact. He'd asked if there was a traditional form, and she'd said the traditional form was the same as the functional form. Both people had to want it, and both people had to make the contact knowing what it was. That evening, in the camp they'd continued to use as a working space even as the court reassembled itself in the recovered fortress. They sat facing each other in the emberstone light. She drew a small blade from her belt, dark metal, plain handle, the kind of tool rather than ornament. She made a shallow cut across her left palm. He watched the blood well up, blue-violet where it met the realm's ambient light. She held the blade out to him, handle first. He took it. Mirrored the cut across his right palm. The blood that welled was red, which she looked at with the same attention she gave to significant things, brief, complete, filed. They pressed their palms together. The contact was immediate and total. The blood frequency connection was nothing like any chakra link he'd experienced before, not the Sage Mode's environmental awareness, not the Kurama integration, not the battle state connections that formed between shinobi in high-level combat. It was quieter and more permanent than any of those, a low-register presence that arrived not as a sensation but as a fact. The way you become aware of a sound that was always there once you know to listen for it. Her presence. The specific quality of it. Old and precise and fierce and containing, somewhere beneath all the centuries of careful management. Something that had been waiting a very long time for something it couldn't name and had now, apparently, found. He felt her feel his. Her palm against his, the blade cuts held together, and he felt the moment she received his blood frequency as a completed thing. The way her breath changed, just slightly. The way the chains at her wrists released something they'd been holding. A loosening that ran from her wrists up through her arms to her shoulders and her spine. He felt, through the new connection, something he hadn't expected, relief. Hers. The deep, foundational kind. The kind that only arrives when something you'd categorized as impossible turns out not to be. He understood it completely because he felt the same thing happening in himself. "Well," Kurama said from somewhere in the warm interior of his chakra network. "I suppose I should introduce myself properly." And to his significant surprise, something answered from Kuraheim's side of the bond, not words, not language, but a frequency acknowledgement, old and complex and not without humor. "She can feel you," Naruto said. "We've been aware of each other since the anchor point," Kurama said, with the specific smugness of someone who has been keeping information back. We've been taking each other's measure. I approve, since you weren't going to ask. You could have mentioned, you were busy figuring it out yourself. I didn't want to shortcut the process. He looked at Kuraiheim, who was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, unguarded, fully, without the layers and the calculation and the centuries of careful management. Just her, looking at him. Your nine-tails, she said, is insufferable. I know, he said. I've gotten used to it. Something in her expression became that thing it sometimes became, the warm thing, the one she didn't intend to show and showed anyway. This time she didn't pull it back. He didn't comment on it. He simply noted it, and held it, and was glad. She opened the rift the following morning. With the blood bond complete, the compact architecture recognized both sides of the original covenant, Uzumaki blood frequency, and Ashen Realm's sovereign frequency, joined. She pressed her palms to the site and the shimmer intensified and passed through the threshold this time without resistance, becoming a genuine opening between the two places. A circle of visible forest light in the wall of the purple turned deep blue sky. He could see the forest of death through it. The massive trees, the pale coins of light on the floor, the humidity he could practically smell from here. He stood in front of it for a moment. Behind him, Kuraiheim stood at the edge of the rift site. He turned and looked at her. The 11 were further back. She told them what the rift was, who he was, what he was going back to. Sari had assessed him with the amber eyes and said something to Kuraiheim that had made Kuraiheim give the small entity a look that could have cut stone. Yoru and Rin were standing together, Yoru with her copper hair and her new smile that she deployed more readily now than when he'd first arrived. He walked back to Kuraiheim. I'll be back, he said. I know, she said. I need to report in. Sort out the situation with the missing person protocols. Explain, he paused. I'll need to explain some of this to some people. Yes. And I'll need to tell them about Segura. He's not just an Ashen Realm problem. The rifts he was pushing against the boundary are connected to the shinobi world's forest of death. If he decides to resume that work, the Hokage's office should know, she agreed. Tell them what they need to know to prepare defenses on their side. She paused. Discreetly, he almost laughed. I'll try. Discretion is not my strongest attribute. I've noticed, she said. Try anyway. He looked at her. Through the blood bond, her presence was a low background note, steady, composed, with something beneath it that he'd characterize as readying rather than waiting. She was already thinking about what came after he stepped through, the work of the court and the realm and the search for Segura. 2 things, he said. What? 1. I'm coming back. Not because the blood bond requires proximity, not because I have a mission here. Because I want to. He held her gaze. That's not up for negotiation. She looked at him steadily. And 2. You said you have information about why the seal on the nine-tails was designed the way it was, he said. Older than my parents. That conversation isn't finished. Something in her expression settled. The specific settling of someone who had been uncertain about whether they would have the chance to finish something and has just been told they will. No, she said. It isn't. He nodded. Turned toward the rift. Her voice stopped him, quiet and direct. Naruto. He turned back. She crossed the space between them in 3 steps and pressed her palm to his chest, over the place where the blood bond connection sat as a background note, and he felt through her palm and through the bond simultaneously. Felt the full weight of 4 centuries of surviving alone and wanting to stop, felt the specific quality of someone who has just received something they'd given up expecting. He put his hand over hers. I'll see you soon, he said. She stepped back. See that you do, she said, and her voice was completely level and the chains at her wrists were blazing blue-violet. He stepped through the rift. The forest of death closed around him with immediate, familiar sensory weight, humidity, the smell of green and decay and old chakra, the sound of birds answering each other in the canopy above. He stood on the massive root-networked floor and breathed it in. The rift closed behind him. The shimmer faded to the ordinary shimmer of dappled light through leaves, through the blood bond, which persisted across whatever distance separated the 2 worlds. Kuraiheim's presence remained, a low, steady note, slightly different now that he was in the shinobi world, more contained, quieter, but absolutely present. She can still feel you, Kurama confirmed. The bond works across the boundary. Interesting. She designed it, Naruto thought back. I don't think she'd have let it go through if it didn't. No, Kurama agreed. She wouldn't have. He stood in the forest of death and looked at the late afternoon light coming through the canopy, and thought about everything he was going to have to explain to everyone in Konoha, and felt the singular blend of complete exhaustion and complete aliveness that he associated with the aftermath of things that had genuinely mattered. He had a blood bond with the sovereign of the Ashen Realm. He had an alliance that the shinobi world didn't know it needed yet. He had information in his blood frequency about the Uzumaki clan's history that predated any written record. And he had, somewhere behind the quiet background note of the bond, the specific awareness of a woman who was 4 centuries old and ancient and difficult and precise and brave in the particular way of someone who keeps going after losing everything, and who had, as far as he could tell, decided sometime around day 3 that she was done categorizing him as a resource, and had not fully adjusted her vocabulary to reflect what she'd decided he was instead. He started walking toward the forest's edge. He'd figure out what to tell Shikamaru. He'd been in worse situations for the explanation afterward. 47 days, Kurama said. What? You were gone 47 days. Time in the Ashen Realm runs differently than time in your world. What was 14 days here was 47 of your world's days. Naruto stopped walking. Oh, he said aloud. Then, with the specific tone of someone revising upward their estimate of how much explaining he was going to have to do, oh no. From behind him, across the boundary, the background note of the blood bond shifted in a way that he was relatively certain was amusement. She knew, he said. She knew and she didn't tell me. The amusement in the bond's background note declined to confirm or deny. He started walking faster.